I'm Robert Scafe, and I'm a lecturer in the expository writing program here at the University of Oklahoma. In this tutorial, I'm going to discuss the very first step in the process of writing the essays for this class, reading and taking notes on the documents you'll be writing about. Both of the essays you will write for this class will be based mainly on primary texts, that is, documents written by people at the time of the events you're studying. Unlike a history textbook, for example, primary sources don't come with a roadmap of what important historical issues you're supposed to be noticing while you read them. And so to get something out of primary sources, to discover the historical problems in them that are worth writing about, you have to read them in an especially attentive way. In particular, you want to read actively, taking notes and asking questions of the document as you go. You have to read contextually, considering where the document came from and how that influences its meaning. And most importantly, you have to read interpretively, going beyond the surface meaning of the text to reveal the underlying themes and assumptions that really make it a window into the past. Let's start with reading actively and taking notes. The first step toward getting more out of your primary sources is to read with a pen in your hand. You need to be ready to write down your immediate responses to what you're reading and to annotate the text in the margins without stopping. At the very least, your pen is a reminder that you're not reading passively, that your thoughts about what you're reading will eventually make their way into your own writing. But of course, holding the pen is not enough. You also need to use it. And so what sorts of notes should you write when you annotate in the margins? First, you want to annotate conversationally. In other words, when you're taking notes on your document, imagine you're actually talking back to the author. Briefly rephrase or pose questions about what they've written. In other words, and but, and why should always be on your mind when you're reading, prompting you to briefly record your reactions. Veteran annotators also develop symbols and systems of shorthand that they use to quickly note key ideas and connections in the text. For example, you can use numbers to outline an author's points when they're listing. You can draw circles around key terms that the author repeats. And you can connect these related terms with arrows and lines. Go ahead and experiment as you develop your own habits of active annotation. There is one mistake to avoid, however. When you're taking notes, refrain from underlining or highlighting large chunks of text. When you do that, you're basically telling yourself, this is important, and later I'll say something about why it's important. In other words, underlining by itself can kind of excuse you from thinking, and these kinds of notes won't be very helpful to you 4 weeks down the road when you're writing your paper. So instead of simply underlining a lengthy passage, ask yourself why you thought it was important, and write a few words representing that thought in the margins. Think of these brief annotations as memory triggers, destined to be read by yourself 4 weeks later when you're composing your final draft. So you write just what you need to your future self so that you'll remember what you were thinking when you first read the document. One more caveat. You can't always annotate by using a pen to write in the margins, of course, but that doesn't mean that you can't or shouldn't actively take notes. You can use Post-its to stick notes to a book that you can't mark up. And programs like Adobe Reader and Microsoft Word have comment functions that allow you to annotate or insert comment bubbles using your keyboard. Now that you know the virtues of actively taking notes while you read, let's look in more detail at the kinds of questions historians ask to tease meaning out of their primary sources. In order to grasp the significance of a text in its time, you first have to familiarize yourself with all the circumstances that gave birth to the document. Who wrote it? When did they write it, and where? Why did they write it? And who was their intended audience? Asking these questions before you read the main body of the text is important, and not only so that you get the bibliographical information right. It's important because the circumstances surrounding the creation of the text give us the first clues about what it meant and how it influenced its own time. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're writing about the American women's movement in the 19th century, and one of your sources is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's speech at the first Women's Rights Convention, which was held at Seneca Falls in 1848. Now, like many of the primary sources you'll be using in this class, Stanton's speech has been edited and introduced by a modern historian. The editor's done a lot of the work for you, grouping the contextual information in an italicized paragraph before the start of Stanton's speech proper. Now, many of your sources will have these editor's introductions, and so don't skip them. They're full of the information you'll want to put the text in its original context. So using our best active reading skills, we're going to see what questions arise from the context of this document. We learn right off the bat that Stanton was not only a women's rights advocate, she was also an abolitionist. Indeed, her discovery that women were not allowed to speak at an English anti-slavery convention seems to have been what sparked her interest in women's rights in the first place. So I'm going to put a memory trigger here, asking about how the abolitionist movement might have influenced the women's movement. We also learned that the Seneca Falls Conference took place in 1848, so I'm going to pause to consider what I've been learning in class about this period. So 1848, this is the year that the Mexican-American War ends. It's also the tail end of the so-called Second Great Awakening, a religious revival which saw rapid growth of evangelical Protestant churches, particularly due to female converts. And so, seeing that the convention included the, quote, religious conditions of women among its concerns, I'm going to connect that with my observation about the Second Great Awakening. Perhaps we'll have a theme here. Finally, the editor informs us that the convention was composed of 300 women and 40 men, so a mainly female audience that may help to explain the arguments that Stanton chose to make in the speech and what she chose to leave out. Now that we've familiarized ourselves with the context of the document, we're ready to start interpreting the main body of the text. If your text is making an explicit argument, as ours is, you certainly want to start by identifying what the author is trying to accomplish. In our case, Stanton makes her purpose very clear from the beginning. We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support. But with many primary sources, most of your interpretation won't be about explicitly stated arguments like this one. Instead, it'll be focused on themes or assumptions that emerge implicitly in the texts. You can think of themes as implied arguments. They're important ideas that aren't declared explicitly, but that emerge from the author's repeated use of terms that are related to one another. Now, sometimes it can be tricky to discover these themes, but the key is recognizing that interpretation begins with a leap of faith. To recognize that a pattern is emerging in a text, you have to notice the first time the author uses the idea, and you have to ask questions about what it means. If you don't permit yourself to guess that this idea may become important, you may never notice when it later develops into a theme. Let's put this into practice and examine a theme that develops in Stanton's case for women's rights. This is the 5th paragraph of Stanton's speech at Seneca Falls, and it immediately follows her reiteration of, quote, the great truth that no just government can be formed without the gut consent of the governed. Having echoed that political principle, Stanton suddenly switches gears to speak about the moral situation of the nation. There seems now to be a kind of moral stagnation in our midst, she declares. Philanthropists have done their utmost to rouse the nation to a sense of its sins. Now, I'm going to circle sins here because it seems like a particularly strong way to talk about the moral failings of the country, and I have a hunch it may become important. Stanton's sudden shift to moral and religious themes was surprising, and it's always a good idea to remark on ideas that surprise or that seem out of place at first reading. Let's see if our hunch pays off. War, slavery, drunkenness, licentiousness, gluttony have been dragged naked before the people, and all their abominations and deformities fully brought to light, yet with idiotic laugh we hug these monsters to our breasts and rush on to destruction. Here our contextual pre-reading is going to pay off a bit, because it prepared us to notice that Stanton's not just talking about war in general, she's referring to the Mexican-American War of 1848. We probably would have learned in lecture that many in the anti-slavery movement also opposed the Mexican-American War, and moreover that many of the anti-slavery crusaders also worked in the temperance movement against the evils of alcohol. So our contextual thinking has prepared us to understand that Stanton sees war, slavery, and drunkenness not as separate problems, but as having a common source. What's that source? Well, now that we've asked the question, let's read on. Our churches are multiplying on all sides. Our missionary societies, Sunday schools, and prayer meetings, and innumerable charitable and reform organizations are all in operation. But still the tide of vice is swelling and threatens the destruction of everything, and the battlements of righteousness are weak against the raging elements of sin and death. Wow, so Stanton's repetition of sin here confirms that we do have a pattern, a religious theme of sin. And now it also seems likely that Stanton is, in a very biblical way, pairing sin with death and destruction in a kind of ultimate battle between good and evil. So I'm going to put another memory trigger here so I won't forget what I was thinking later on. Sin seems to be the common source of the nation's problems. And sin is related to a view of history as a battle between righteousness and sin or death. Let's see how these themes play out. Verily, the world waits the coming of some new element, some purifying power, some spirit of mercy and love. The voice of woman has been silenced in the state, the church, and the home, but man cannot fulfill his destiny alone. He cannot redeem his race unaided. There are deep and tender chords of sympathy and love in the hearts of the downtrodden and oppressed that woman can touch more skillfully than man. Again, let's isolate some of the religious terms now that we've identified this theme. Why did she use these words? The world awaits the coming of some new element. Spirit, mercy, love, and redeem. Well, given that we've just noticed that Stanton portrays American politics as a kind of cosmic battle between sin and death, we're prepared to see that Stanton is comparing women's role in society and politics to the second coming of the Christian Savior at the end times. Her use of the word coming hints at this interpretation. And also, the language of purification and redemption seems to confirm it. And so, she concludes, women, if they're allowed to fully participate in society and politics, will be a powerful force of mercy and love that will help men redeem the nation from its sins and from the destruction that will follow in their wake. So at this point, just by noticing how these religious terms work together to support Stanton's argument, we've done some great close reading. Now, later, as you start analyzing your notes and writing your essay, Themes like these, national redemption or women's Christian capacity for mercy, these themes will help you to create a topic for your essay. You might ask, for example, how women's roles in churches help them argue their political rights. You might ask conversely, how associating women's public role with Christian charity might have conditioned or limited the argument for full political equality. Again, these are the sort of questions that will emerge as you go over your notes and as you work the evidence in the weeks after your initial reading of these texts. The point now is that such critical questions presuppose that you've already taken the trouble to attentively read and to identify such themes in the first place. To summarize then, there are 3 keys to identifying important themes in your primary sources. First, reading actively. Mark up the text with your thoughts and your questions, even when you're not sure yet whether they're right. Allow yourself to follow your hunches, or you'll never notice the patterns of repeated language when they start to emerge. 2, reading contextually. Use contextual materials like title pages, prefaces, and those editors' introductions to answer the who, when, where, and why questions. Putting the text in its own time will help you connect your reading to the larger themes that you're discovering in your course lectures and in your readings for the class. And finally, reading interpretively. In addition to noting what the author is saying explicitly, dig deeper to what they're implying or to what they're assuming. Put this kind of close, active reading into practice from the very first weeks of this course, and your future self will thank you for all those memory triggers you so helpfully left in the margins of your sources.